Okay, this video is How to Write Better, Part 6. We're going to talk about how to add emphasis today. This is coming from this book. This is a book I wrote called Rhyme, Rhetoric, and Logic. It's a 4th edition, I think, on here, yeah. So basically, learning how to add emphasis is an important part of becoming a better writer. Basically, when something is an important part of whatever it is you're trying to say, you want to add emphasis. And there's lots of tricks you can do. Simply just being aware of it, you start getting better at it. Okay, learning to add emphasis is essential. It's like for the writer, the equivalent of going through puberty. It was Handel from whom I learned that a good style depends on force of assertion. That's George Bernard Shaw talking about Handel. Handel was like the best music composer ever for having a crescendo effect to come to like a emotional climax. Okay, and you want to be able to do that with your writing. So it's good to study poetry because poetry, they're interested in putting concentrated meaning and sound effects into, short little stanzas and rhymes. And it's very much like writing a song. This guy, Pat Pattison, is quite good at that. He has a course online where he teaches people how to write songs and how words work, the sound patterns and the rhymes, and you can go through all the phonetics and stuff. So here's his quote, Pat Pattison. The English language is like diamonds on a black velvet cloth. The diamonds are the nouns and verbs, and we can use rhyme to shine spotlights on them. So I thought that was an amazing statement. It helped me to understand stuff because I always struggled with trying to understand where do you put the stress and the accents if you're writing poetry, for example. And basically, the meaning words, the subject, the verb, the object and whatnot, they will tend to be stressed. They're also longer. You say them louder. In general, that's a good way to refer to stress. You say the word louder. And these are the words that have meaning. They're usually longer. And then the grammar words are the short things in between. And, this, articles, particles, conjunctions, and whatnot. So understanding how something works will help you to look at a line and feel the stress, the meter in it. So when you're really trying to pay attention to a line, you can do that. Most of the time, you just go by the feel. It sounds good or it doesn't. If you're good and fluent in a language, you'll just have that sense. But once in a while, when you're trying to decide between, word choices, having a sense of the meter and the stress and all that can help. It's good to understand the idea of power positions in a word. Usually like the first word or right at the beginning of a sentence is a power position and right at the end of the sentence is a power position. So the Ciceronian sentence coming from Cicero, the greatest of all Romans, was to put the key word right at the end. It's also called a periodic sentence, and you can remember that because the key word is right next to the period. So here's a typical Ciceronian sentence. To not know what happened before you were born is to forever remain a child. And that's also called the professorial technique. And it sounds completely worked out and confident, like you said it a million times and you know what you're talking about. So when you want to come down real confident on something, a Ciceronian sentence can be useful. Phonological features are things that sort of affect the sound of it. And part of where I got interested in this is my kids were listening to rap with that Eminem, and I think in a lot of ways he's kind of a lowlife, but man, I said, turn off that crap. The joke is that Van Gogh had to listen to that, he would have cut off his other ear. And my kids are like, no, Dad, you're wrong. Eminem's a genius. You should study him. So I went and I studied Eminem, some of his songs, and I was amazed at how brilliant it was. How it was incredibly brilliant, his poetry and his use of rhyme and internal rhyme and assonance and all that stuff. It really was. It was shocking how brilliant it was. He's like an idiot savant. All right, so here's a line from Noah Lukeman. He wrote a good book called The First 5 Pages, about getting the first 5 pages of a book to be optimal. And he talks about good writing is high contrast. So yeah, what you're really learning how to do is add extra attention, extra emphasis on the key parts. And the other thing I noticed when I write a book, it's much more corny. There's a lot of little jokes that seem just fine to say when you're writing. You're playing along, trying to have fun with the reader and keep them interested and stuff and encourage them versus, in conversation, you wouldn't say them as much. So it's just silliness, but I see myself when I read my own books, I put a lot of corny silliness in there. Variety is the spice of romance. Contrast is the spice of prose craftsmanship. Chiasmus highlights contrast. Okay, so what that's all about. Chiasmus is very useful to know. It's a rhetorical form. Rhetorical forms are like templates. When you put them in, you add emphasis to things. Okay, so the classic rhetorical template is, one time the kids were studying for their high school and they had to learn some rhetoric or something. I was walking by, they're like, do you know any rhetoric? And I said, yeah, JFK, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And they go, oh yeah, that's so old, Does anybody ever use this stuff in real life? And I'm like, yeah, you could say, ask not what a husband can do for a wife, but what a wife can do for a husband. And then they started to smile. I said, ask not what a boyfriend can do for a girlfriend, but what a girlfriend can do for a boyfriend. Okay, you just play with them. You can plug whatever words you want into the sentence, but once you know the template, you can have fun with it. Okay, so basically the brain is programmed to try to recognize patterns because the brain wants to predict the future. The brain is always trying to predict the future so it can survive. The purpose of a brain is to be able to walk down a path in a forest or a jungle and to survive. It has to be able to predict what is going to happen next, what is going to happen next. So it just always is paying attention. You can't turn off your ears. So the brain wants to decrease uncertainty. It wants to increase predictability. So it can make better choices for survival and reproduction. So whenever we hear a phrase, if there's something unique about it, there's a rhyme or there's one of these rhetorical templates, the brain pays close attention to that. One characteristic thing is something called binary opposition. So when two things are opposite, the brain likes that because that's how the brain judges things, by making comparisons and also by comparing it, comparing to the things in the immediate context, but also comparing to what we already know in our brain. So whenever there's binary opposition, meaning like a direct contrast, the brain likes that because that's very easy for it to understand things. The brain sort of has on the outer surface what's called a task-based network for doing boring, routine, logical things like what one will typically have to do at school or at a job. And then in the middle, like along the cingulate gyrus, it has what's called the default mode network, and that's more for processing emotional things. We actually care more about these emotional things than we do about most of these logical things, which would probably be the equivalent in our previous lives as, foraging. Okay, so task-based network is mostly logical, sort of a little bit sometimes called left brain, if you will. When at school, when at work, most brain activities, TBN, task-based network. The center of the brain is primarily the default mode network, DMN. And for thinking about our personal life, the anterior cingulate gyrus is where you make an error correction. So that's a big deal. When you sense that you've made a mistake or you've done something stupid, you're like, oops, and that really gets you to pay attention to it. Okay, so default mode network might be thinking about, she loves me not, why doesn't she like me, why did she give me that look, should I talk to her tomorrow, or maybe I should avoid her, that type of thing. So it's also quite emotional. Anterior cingulate is active, like when we ask a mutual friend, how she's doing, and he tells you, oh, she moved to another continent. Obviously, she's not interested in you. Okay, but that's kind of how the brain works. If you put a person on a functional MRI scan and have them close their eyes, they will tell you, and then you ask them, what are you thinking about? They're almost always are thinking about their relationships. What happened yesterday, what they're going to do tomorrow, that sort of thing. So that's another point, is that's how the brain maps time. With the default mode network, it travels into the past to think about what happened yesterday, and it can also travel into the future, if you will. It's the machine for time travel, thinking about what's going to happen tomorrow with the person that they have a relationship with, for example. Okay, whereas the task-based network on the outside of the brain primarily is preoccupied with the immediate moment, with the present. That's also why if a person is unhappy, they're sad, they're depressed, one of the best things they can do is just get busy with the present moment, because then their brain activity, you can only really concentrate consciously on about one thing at a time. So in the task-based network, when that's active and you're involved in the present, you forget about things you are obsessing about from the past or the future. So that's why it can be therapeutic. Okay, so getting back to that, when I made a joke with the rhetorical template of chiasmus and said, ask not what a husband can do for a wife, but what a wife can do for a husband. By flipping that pattern back on itself, that will activate the anterior cingulate cortex. That was a surprise. You're going down a predictable pattern, and all of a sudden there was a surprise, and the brain will pay attention to that. So that's why throwing surprises into your writing is more fun. It generates a lot of neural activity in the reader, and it makes it more fun. So, the joke here is that the oxytocin overdosed, testosterone depleted manservant has finally stood up for himself. Okay. Here's Richard Lanham. He wrote a very good book called Analyzing Prose. He has a quote about chiasmus. Chiasmus is like verbal judo. It takes the energy of the first phrase and it turns it back on itself. And a typical example, here's from Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde's like the greatest writer who ever lived at chiasmus. He has tons of good quotes of chiasmus. Here's just a typical one. The only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about. Okay, chiasmus, like I said, it activates binary opposition, that there's a strong abrupt comparison and a bit of a surprise there. So again, lots of neural activity, gets attention, it's very memorable. Things that generate emotion, surprise, they're memorable. And you want your key point to be memorable. Okay? Look at the O.J. Simpson case. The only thing most people remember is that rhyme. If the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. And so stuff like that, it sticks in our mind. Rhyme, of course, is great for making something memorable. Okay, another thing is, how does the brain work? How does the brain work for learning things? This is a quote by Douglas Hofstadter. He wrote a book called Fluid Concepts and Creative Analogies. He wrote another book called Essences. And the gist of it is, the entire book's all about analogies, because that's how the brain works. The brain basically has a ton of information stored away. And when new information comes in, it immediately says, how is that like what I already know? How is that different? And it connects it to those information circuits of how the object is like the other things or different from them. And that's how you file all your new memories. Everything is a comparison to what you already know. And that's also why the more you know, the more you can learn, because the bigger system of information you have to file new information away. Okay, so here's this quote from Hofstadter. He says, like a fish that doesn't know it's in water, we live in a sea of analogies. Analogies are the motor of thought. Okay, so I hope you recognize that I said some pretty interesting things, I think. I found this fascinating when I first learned this. That is how the brain categorizes information, by analogies, by comparisons, metaphors as well, and just comparing it to what you know. It's like that or it's not like that. And that's how we categorize all our thought. That's how we map cognitive space, whereas the way we map time was task-based network for the present, default mode network for the past and future. That's how the brain works. Okay, binary opposition really helps children learn. Like, they'll see one thing is good, another thing is bad. And that's why fairy tales are so good. So this guy, Karen Egan and Gillian Judson, they wrote a lot about they wrote some good stuff about education for children. That's one of them. Yeah, fairy tales are a great thing to read to kids. Einstein used to say, if you want your kid to be smart, read them fairy tales. You want them to be smarter, read them more fairy tales. Reading really helps kids a lot. Whenever something's emotional, that will increase memory. So the way you jack up the interest in something is you make it emotional. You have a surprise in it. You have a joke in it. You have rhetorical templates in there like, chiasmus or antithesis or these other things. You can also start to play around with the font. For example, if you want to, look at a comedian, somebody like Sam Kinison. He'll gradually build up to something and then he'll say it really loud. That's changing his volume, changing his speed. That makes it entertaining. That makes it funny. So you get a volume control in a sense by making all caps. All caps is like yelling. So you want to use it sparingly, but it's good to know when to use it. So there it is, volume control. You just throw in all caps and it's like you're yelling that part of the phrase for emphasis. Okay, a couple more things here. You can also use all capital letters in different ways. You can capitalize the first letter of every word if you want, like in a title. Play around with it. Whatever feels right is probably right. You have this internal ability to judge what's funny and what's good just from having worked with the language all these years. So use that. Just be aware of it and you can use it. Okay, you can make the letter extra big. Sometimes you'll have it drop below the line. It's called a drop caps. And it just sort of shows the reader that you're doing something fun. You're trying to have fun with the words and the letters and the fonts. And that sends a good message to the reader that this is going to be fun. This is not just boring routine type writing. Using bold is good, but again, you have to use it sparingly, only when you think it's relevant to the moment. But that's pretty strong emphasis. And you can see how you can start cranking up the emphasis. You can use bold, you can use all caps, you can throw rhymes in there, and you can start throwing other sound tricks in there. Alliteration, front rhyme with the first letter, assonance, rhyme in the middle of it with the vowels. Regular rhyme is end rhyme at the end of the word. So all of these tricks, and that was what Eminem was such a master at. He had all this alliteration and assonance going on. It was like row, row, row your boat gently down the stream, and then there was all these overlapping segments with all the different rhymes. There's good YouTube videos about how Eminem writes his poetry. I think you'd be shocked at how good it was. Okay, punctuation, pauses are timing effects, like with the comma, semicolon, period. And you play games with that stuff. just the amount of time. Comma is actually very brief. Okay, semicolon's a little longer, period's longer, colon's longer. So you decide how you're going to work it. Then a paragraph is an even bigger break. Okay, you can even put a horizontal line in there. All of this is done just to create the feel of how you would say it if you're having a conversation with an intelligent friend. So that's what you do too when you write. You sub-vocalize and you're all like saying it. Imagine you're talking to your friend, and where would you pause? What would, a pause can really help for emphasis. That's what they talk about, the pregnant pause before the delivery. And a colon is usually a good way to do it. We're going to talk about punctuation in a later chapter. This is the last slide for this talk today. But just being aware, you can start playing around with emphasis. That will really help you a lot. Again, look at the great comedians. Look at Sam Kinison. Look at Eddie Murphy. When they deliver their punchline, man, it's got a pop. It's a surprise, an emphasis. It's dramatic. The timing, everything goes into making that special. Okay, there's something called a Demetrius sentence. A Demetrius sentence means the first and the last word are stressed. So it's typically a short, forceful, memorable sentence. And I remember Demetrius, I think of it like bookmarks. Okay, the first word I actually, to remind myself, I would capitalize the DE and then the last two letters. Okay, and so some famous sentences, Exodus chapter 20, verse 7 is, let my people go. So the let and the go, you can feel there's an emphasis in the word. Let my people go. Okay, Proverbs 16:18, pride goeth before the fall. Okay, Thomas Paine, these are the times that try men's souls. Okay, you can just kind of feel it, that the first and the last word are the big words. And this is good for making things memorable. So when you've got something you want to say, you'll write out the preliminary sentence, and then you ask yourself, does this feel right? Does this feel powerful? And then just rewrite it a couple different ways and say it a couple different ways, and usually it'll become obvious. So the point of knowing this stuff is just being aware. The beginning of the sentence and the end of the sentence are the power positions. So if you can put the keywords in those two positions, that sentence will be more memorable. Okay. Let's see. Okay, here's Cicero. Friendship doubles our joy and halves our grief. All right. Here's a quote by Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of DNA double helix. A good scientist values criticism almost higher than friendship. No, in science, criticism is the height of friendship. Okay, so again, criticism, friendship, the two front and end of it make it a Demetrius sentence. You can do other things. Having a footnote will add some emphasis. Anytime you change out of the regular pattern of just continuous prose, you're adding emphasis to whatever it is that you're saying. Here's another Demetrius sentence, this one from Seneca. Time is the greatest remedy for anger. Okay? And also, when we talk about the first word being powerful and the last word of the sentence being powerful, so if you have a short sentence, those two power words are kind of close together. And so that's partly what makes those sayings more memorable. Plus, short things are easier to memorize. You can make the middle of the sentence a power position if you set it off with a dash, a hyphen, but you can use an M dash. An M dash is like about as long as the letter M, and usually it depends on your keyboard and how your word processing program works, but usually if you hit the hyphen button twice, you'll get that long M dash, and you can use that to set off something as key being in the middle of a sentence. And these things can be used for effect. It's an interrupt, so this double interrupt, so there's a long M dash on both sides of the keyword in the middle, and that can give you that effect when you want that. So anyways, that was an introduction to adding emphasis. I got a lot more on adding emphasis, so hope that helps.